For centuries, convents have been seen as spaces of contemplation and spirituality, places where women, they dedicated their lives to the faith, distant from the outside world. But the reality within these walls was not always as imagined. For many, life in the convent was not a choice, but an imposition. Since very small, some girls were sent by their families without right to decide. In a society where marriage required a dowry, many families without resources, they saw the convent as the only alternative for their daughters. Others, however, were worn for reasons of tradition or belief, with the hope that they would find a purpose in religious life. However, the transition was not always easy. Discipline was strict, and the day by day was marked by unbreakable rules. The day began before the dawn, with long prayers and long hours of work. The letters to the family were supervised, silence was a norm, and the obedience a fundamental principle. For some, life in the convent was a path of surrender and devotion. For others, a difficult routine to endure. Spiritual formation and life in community were fundamental pillars, but also existed challenges. The rules of some religious orders were demanding, and those who failed adapt. They could face periods of isolation or penances that reinforced the reflection and the commitment with his vocation. Throughout the history, they have stories about life in the convents, some showing experiences of deep personal growth and others revealing difficulties that marked many women. With he passed of the time, some orders they have evolved, adapting their practices to a more human vision and closer to the needs of its members. The history of convents is broad and complex. In some cases were learning and cultural spaces, where many women they found education and a structured life. In others, strict rules and tests of faith were challenging. That really happened in its interior. What was the daily life of the nuns like? What were the moments more difficult and the acts of resilience that marked his history? Today, we will explore the different aspects of life in the convents along the time. Through historical documents and testimonies, we will discover what was he like day to day within these communities and how its impact has transcended to our days. Get ready for a trip back in time, where we will unravel the truths and myths of one of the most enigmatic institutions of the history. For centuries, many youths were taken to convents with the promise of a life of peace, faith, and purpose. Some it accepted with devotion. For them, the convent represented a shelter, a space where they could surrender to the spirituality and finding deep meaning in the prayer and the service. But for others, the history was different. For many, there was no choice. In the society of past times, the destiny of the women was almost always decided by their families. Marriage required a dowry, and not all could pay for it. For these young women, the convent was not a call, but an obligation. Some were entering being just girls, without understand that one gate that was closing after, they would mark a before and a after in their lives. Unlike genuine vocations, many of these young women they entered without having felt the religious calling. Some were daughters of families nobles who, for economic or strategic reasons, were sent to monastic life. Others, orphans or without resources, found in the convent was their only option for survival. But what they found inside wasn't always what they expected. From the moment they crossed the door from the convent, their lives changed completely. They left behind their name and your past. The first stage consisted in the novitiate, a trial period where they learned the discipline of monastic life. There, they are taught the importance of the sacrifice, the humility, and the obedience. The days were long and strict. They woke up at dawn for the first prayer of the day. Then, a day of work and learning began. Some were dedicated to the copy of manuscripts, the teaching or embroidery. Others, they worked in the kitchen, the orchards, or the nursing. Everything had to be become in silence and with absolute discipline. For some, life in the convent was an opportunity for education and stability. They were taught to read and write, something uncommon for the women in many historical periods. In addition, they had access to religious and philosophical texts that helped in his spiritual formation. But for others, the adaptation was difficult. Silence was a strict rule. Talking without permission or question the rules could bring consequences. Absolute obedience was a fundamental principle, and not all of them succeeded. Get used to it. Some were passing by nights, whole crying, missing their families or wondering if they would ever see the outside world again. Letters to their families were supervised and, in many cases, censored. It was not allowed express doubts, neither complaints. For some, the convent was a place of spiritual enlightenment, but for others, the feeling of confinement was suffocating. Some youths, they tried rebel. There are known cases of women who tried flee, but escape was not easy. The walls were high, the doors were watched, and consequences of the disobedience could be severe. Some managed to be heard and released, but many others accepted their destiny and lived the rest of their lives within the convent. The history of convents is full of contrasts. For some, women was a space for growth, learning and service. For others, a life of confinement and resignation. But this is just the beginning. In the next chapter, we will explore the stricter rules and the sacrifices that had to be made to stay within the order. Life in the convent not only involved prayer and meditation, it was an environment governed by strict rules that shaped the character of the nuns and assured absolute discipline. From the moment a young woman entered, had to leave behind your previous identity and completely submit to the authority of the church. The day began before the dawn. At 4 in the morning, the sound of the bells marked the start of the day. First was the morning prayer, where all the nuns had to meet up in the chapel for collective prayer. After this, each one had to achieve with their homework diaries. Silence was a fundamental rule. Talking without permission was prohibited, even within the bedrooms or during meals. The nuns had to communicate with gestures or wait for specific hours in those that were allowed speaking. This practice, they said, helped to avoid distractions and maintain the connection with the divine. Besides of silence, the obedience was a principle unbreakable. Each nun had to follow the orders without question them. The Mother Superior had total control over their lives, and disobeying meant face severe consequences. Penances were part of the formation process. It was believed that the suffering strengthened his spirit and brought the nuns closer to God. Some practices included prolonged fasting, long hours of prayer on one's knees, and the use of hair shirts. Garments with metal tips designed to cause discomfort as a form of purification. If a nun committed a fault, the punishment depended on the gravity of the act. A minor mistake, such as speaking out of turn or displaying an attitude considered vain, could punish oneself with jobs, additional or sleepless nights in prayer. More serious faults could take to the seclusion in an isolation cell, where the nun had to reflect on her mistake in complete solitude. In some convents, public penances were practiced. A nun who broke a rule could be forced to kneel in her floor cold of the cloister for hours, while the rest of the sisters, they prayed for his soul. In other cases, should walk through the hallways with the head covered and dressed with a special mantle that indicated his lack. The living conditions were austere. They slept in single beds, many times without mattress, and ate limited rations of bread, vegetables, and water. The idea was to get rid of the worldly pleasures and living in complete humility. The rules, too, regulated the correspondence with the exterior. Every letter sent or received, I had to go through the supervision of the Mother Superior. If a nun expressed doubts about your vocation or asked go back with his family, his letter could be censored or even destroyed. Not all of them succeeded, bear the strict discipline. Some adapted and found meaning in religious life, but others suffered in silence. For those who couldn't getting used to it, the convent became in a place of isolation, where the time it seemed stop and the hope of getting out was fading with the years. Despite the strict rules, some nuns tried to challenge the system. There were cases where those who in secret wrote letters that managed go out from the convent and reach their families. Others, they looked for ways to escape, although few succeeded. They achieved without being discovered. Life inside the convents was a balance between faith, discipline, and sacrifice. For some, complete dedication; for others, a perpetual confinement. In the next chapter, we will explore the darkest mysteries hidden behind these walls. For centuries, convents were places of devotion and isolation, spaces where the outside world was left behind. However, within their walls, stories that challenged the ideals of purity and sacrifice. Some accounts reveal that not all convents were havens of peace, but places where secrets were kept that few people dared to question. One of the most striking aspects of convent life were the absolute control over the nuns. Obedience was not just a rule, but a principle unwavering. The nuns were expected to follow every order without a doubt, no matter how difficult or unfair it may seem. Any sign of rebellion could bring severe consequences. Throughout the history, stories have emerged from women who were entered against his will. Many of them never felt religious vocation, but they were forced by their families to take the vows. Some, they tried to escape, and few did so. They managed. There are known cases where, upon being discovered, the fugitives were returned to the convent and subjected to exemplary punishments to prevent further escapes. Silence was not only a norm within the convent, but a strategy to hide what was happening in its interior. The testimonies of some former nuns revealed that the absolute isolation allowed certain situations will remain in the darkness, without possibility of being reported. There are also historical documents that describe the control that some abbesses exercised over the nuns. In certain convents, the authority of the Mother Superior was unquestionable. Some nuns denounced having lived under extremely severe rules, which went beyond common discipline. Another topic that has raised the curiosity of historians is the existence of hidden tunnels and secret rooms within some convents. These passageways, according to some theories, would have been used for various purposes, from ensuring the communication with the outside to serve as confinement areas for those who they disobeyed the rules. At different times, records have been found that speak of strict penances imposed on the nuns who put in doubt his vocation. Some were forced to spend long hours in cells dark, dedicated to the prayer and the reflection. In certain cases, these penances lasted for days or even weeks. Beyond the internal life of the convent, also existed episodes in those in which the ecclesiastical authorities intervened to prevent certain scandals came to light. Documents have been found suggesting that when a situation became too difficult to conceal, steps were taken to move the nuns involved to other convents or to eliminate any proof of what happened. Despite the strict control, some nuns managed to hear his voice. At different times of the history, there have been recorded testimonies of women who left convent life and recounted the difficulties they faced. Some they found support in their families and were able to reintegrate into the society, while others were seen with, "I am wary of having abandoned the habit." The secrets of the convents have fascinated and disturbed generations. Some stories have been confirmed with historical documents, while others remain in the uncertainty, wrapped up in the mystery of the walls that still stand standing. But the story does not end here. In the next chapter, we will explore escape attempts and stories of those women who challenged the rules to recover your freedom. In the interior of the convents, the obedience was an absolute rule. Every nun was expected to follow the rules without question them, dedicating his life to the prayer and service. But not all accepted that silent destiny. Throughout the history, there was who challenged the rules and looked for a way out, risking everything for the possibility of recovering your freedom. Escaping from a convent was not a task simple. The walls were high, the doors remained closed with key, and the accesses were watched. However, some women dared to defy these obstacles. Historical records speak of nuns who, desperate to get out, devised escape plans that in some cases they had success. One of the most commonly used methods were to take advantage of the darkness of the night. In some convents, there were secret tunnels that, according to stories, were used by nuns who tried to flee. In other cases, the nuns told, with the help from outsiders, who facilitated their escape. However, many times the fugitives were discovered before achieving their goal. When a nun tried to escape and was captured, the consequences were severe. Depending on the convent and the era, they could face long periods of isolation, be forced to fast, or receive penances that sought to break any attempt at rebellion. The objective was clear: to prevent other nuns from following suit. His example, despite the fear of the retaliation, there was who they achieved reached the freedom. Some, they found shelter in their families, while others, they needed to change their identities to avoid being found. However, even those who managed to escape faced a hostile world. In many societies, a former nun was seen as suspicion, and few opportunities they expected outside the convent walls. But there were not only escape attempts. At different times during the history, they have documented cases of rebellion within the convents. Some nuns joined together to question the authority of the Mother Superior or demand better conditions. Although these episodes were uncommon, they show that not all accepted your destiny without endurance. One of the more cases acquaintances occurred in the 19th century Jews, when a group of nuns reported the conditions of a convent and managed to attract the attention of the authorities. Although initially there was an attempt to silence the scandal, the public pressure forced an investigation into what was happening inside the facility. These stories show that even in the strictest environments, there were those who dared to challenge the rules. Some, they paid a high price for its rebellion, while others, they achieved right his own destiny. But the history, it's not over yet. In the next chapter, we will reflect on the impact of these experiences and how the vision of the convents has changed with the time. For centuries, convents have been spaces of spirituality, discipline, and isolation. For some women, represented a path of personal growth and dedication. For others, it's an imposed destiny marked by rules, unbreakable, and a life of sacrifice. Throughout this tour, we have explored the lights and shadows of monastic life, since the forced entry of many young people until the rigorous discipline that shaped their days. From the strict rules to the punishments imposed on those who did not comply with expectations. We also met stories of rebellion and escape, testimonies of women who defied the system in search of its freedom. With time, the religious orders have evolved, adapting to new realities. Many convents have changed their norms and practices, focusing in the education, the social assistance and spirituality lived from the election and the personal commitment. But the history of these places continues being a topic of debate. Were they really spaces of devotion or, in many cases, prisons hidden? The answer depends on each experience, on each voice that has ever inhabited after those walls. Now, the question is for you. What do you think about life in the convents? Did you know these stories? Share your perspective in the comments and let's continue exploring together mysteries of the history. Found this story shocking? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with who enjoys stories that challenge what we think we know. See you in the next mystery.